Booked and then come take my hand. We're rebels with a paperback plan.
Welcome to Booked and Banned, the podcast, where we discuss essential literature that has faced challenges and censorship. Today, we'll be talking about S.E. Hinton's young adult novel, The Outsiders. Paige, welcome to Booked and Banned. Please tell our listeners a little bit about who you are and what your connection is to these kinds of books.
Thank you, Naomi, so much for having me. My name's Paige, and I'm a professor, and I specialize in children's and young adult literature. And that's, and I teach this at the college level, and that's what my research is. My first book was Cupboard Porter's American Children's Literature and Journalism in the Golden Age, and I'm finishing up my second book called Children of the Black Press, and that specifically looks at the writing of Black youth in the 20th century and that they published in periodicals, newspapers, magazines. And so I've always been, or I've become more interested in the actual writing of young people. And I didn't necessarily think of that when I was first studying The Outsiders in graduate school and thinking about it from a more theoretical perspective. But S.E. Hinton, published The Outsider, who wrote and published The Outsiders, was 15 when she started writing it, and 16 when she published it, and we are still talking about it today. And I think it's still a good read. And it's funny, I didn't actually read The Outsiders till I was in graduate school studying it, and because it's considered one of the first books of YA, and I say that meaning that as a publishing category, right? Because people have been writing about young people since we started telling stories. You could call, Jane Eyre or Pride and Prejudice, quote unquote, YA, because it looks at the lives of, young adults. But I mean, as this category of publishing, which people have various feelings about, I think, unfortunately, YA gets all these connotations with it when you say it. Usually it's associated with teen girls, and teen girls, unfortunately, people have thoughts about teen girls, and again, which is all very silly. S.E. Hinton this book really put a fire under, I guess, agents and publishers, like, oh, we can make this its own category. And because for a long time, I mean, the idea of the teenager, I mean, that didn't really come to be a category or a category of commercial interest, I guess I should say, until really the 40s on, and a lot of that has to do with people buying cars, and I could go into a whole thing. But anyway, back to the point. But I knew about this book, and I knew about The Outsiders since I was a kid, because I had an older sister, and she always had a copy around. I can even see the copy that she had in my head, that paperback book. And she loved this book, and she also loved the film, as so many people did. Both girls, young women, and probably, gay guys really loved that film because it had all the hot young actors of the time. So again, it was always in my, periphery, but I didn't actually read it until graduate school, funny enough.
Wow, that's a great history. I mean, I saw the movie first and then the book, then read the book afterward, because the movie had come out like on HBO or something like that. I had to watch it at my friend's house who had cable because we didn't have cable. But before we really get into it, I'm going to give a little overview of the book for our listeners. So The Outsiders is a coming-of-age novel by S.E. Hinton, which Paige mentioned. It's set in the 1960s in Tulsa, Oklahoma, though that's never made explicit. And it focuses on the class conflict between two teenage gangs, the working-class greasers and the affluent Socs. Soc is short for socials. The story is narrated by 14-year-old greaser Ponyboy Curtis, who lives with his older brothers, Derry, short for Daryl, and Soda Pop, after their parents' death, which was a mere 8 months before. The intense rivalry between the greasers and the Socs drives the plot, which escalates when Ponyboy's friend, Johnny Cade, kills a Soc named Bob Sheldon in self-defense after the Socs attempt to drown Ponyboy. Ponyboy and Johnny go into hiding, but later act heroically by saving children from a burning church. Johnny sustains fatal injuries in the fire. Following a final violent rumble between the gangs and the death of another greaser, Dallas Winston, Ponyboy struggles to cope. Ultimately, a judge acquits Ponyboy of responsibility for Bob Sheldon's death and does not remove him from his brother Derry's care to a foster home. The novel concludes with Ponyboy deciding to write about his experiences for a school assignment, realizing that he is not defined solely by the greaser label, but by his ability to recognize and articulate the shared humanity and pain across social divides. The Outsiders has been a frequently challenged and banned book since its publication, ranking very high on the American Library Association's list of most frequently challenged books for decades. The primary reasons cited for banning the novel from some schools and libraries include a portrayal of gang violence and its consequences, including murder, underage smoking and drinking, which some objectors feel glamorizes these behaviors, strong language and slang and perceived obscenities, family dysfunction, and the lack of positive adult role models, with virtually all characters coming from difficult family and home situations. Despite the controversies, however, many schools across the U.S. have retained the book, recognizing its value in exploring relevant themes like class, prejudice, loyalty, friendship, and the search for identity, often using it as part of their middle or high school English curriculum. And so now that we have that context, let's dive in. Paige, you actually kind of already did go over why you chose it, but is there anything you want to add?
I mean, I was looking over and I have like my book and all its, marked pages, and I was going back over it and in your great introduction, thinking about it, there are almost no adults in the book. And I mean, there's the mention of the English teacher, right? There's always that English teacher in high school, and I mean, we could, whether it's like Perks of a Wallflower or whatever, there's always that English teacher. But that English teacher is rarely mentioned. We see briefly Johnny Cade's mom when she comes to see him at the hospital, and he doesn't want to see her. Adults outside the church where Johnny and Ponyboy escape to, but really, I mean, they're so on the fringes, and so I think that's really fascinating, and I think this is probably why this book became so popular, is that we have this very authentic voice of Ponyboy. And again, I don't like to think too much about the author, but I think you really cannot not bring S.E. Hinton, because she was 15 when she was writing it, and so it feel like the narration feels so close. And of course, yes, it's first person, but I think it's more than that. I think part of it is that it feels like a young person talking, and I think that's why young people connect with it. Authenticity is there, and I think you feel that even when you're reading it at an older age, that's why you want to keep reading. It's because it feels authentic, and this has always been a tension. And it's one of the reasons I'm so interested in children's literature and young adult literature. It's because it's the only category, I guess not the only, but it's when we're thinking about, Black American literature or Asian American literature, it's defined by the people who write it, where that is not generally the case for children's and young adult literature. But here we actually do have a young person who's writing it. And so I think it makes it one of those unique works. And, that's why, I find it so interesting and compelling. And I think another reason, and I've taught this book to college students, and many of them had read it, or some had read it before. Some come and they're like obsessed with it. Like, this is my favorite book of all time. But so often they say it's the favorite book, their favorite book that they read in the class, or they loved revisiting it. And I think that even though, and I teach at largely a majority minority college. I teach in Atlanta, and mostly to art students. And I think even though the characters in this book they're in Tulsa, from what we can see that they're mostly white characters, I think that people can read this, and it has that it's called The Outsiders. And I think no matter, so many people when they are in adolescence, it's just this, you always feel like even the people who I think are popular, which we see with Cherry, right? There's some way we feel that we don't belong. And whether that is because of racial conflict, because of economic disparities, whether that's because of, one's queer identity, like there's some reason people feel that they don't belong. And I think even I think you can read yourself into this no matter what that is. And I think that's why people still read it and it still resonates.
Absolutely. It certainly resonated for me reading it again now as an adult, after having seen the movie and then read it when I was kind of in that teenage milieu. So you've written for academic audiences about how The Outsiders challenges this long held association between youth and innocence. And could you elaborate on how S.E. Hinton's portrayal of the Greasers, particularly Ponyboy and Johnny, undermines this quote unquote myth of American youth and demonstrates that innocence is often not the lived reality of kids or teens or young adults? Your work points out that the real world experiences of young people, especially those facing socioeconomic conflict and political issues, it often does not correspond with this conventional idealized notion of youthful innocence.
Yeah. And I think to the point of your whole podcast, right? This idea of ban. So many of the books that get banned or challenged are for young people, and they're challenged by adults and what adults think young people should or should not know or be exposed to. And so that's just kind of, again, this myth of, well, shouldn't know this because they're quote unquote innocent. And again, we are born into the world. We are not innocent. And I think even these people who ban books, think back to when you were on the bus and what, being on the back of the bus and the curse words you would say, or again, I'm sure the same people who challenge these books, maybe they're remembering their own childhood when they would like go into their, and I guess people would, I don't know if they still do this. This is more of like maybe nice when you go and you find mom and dad's dirty books or not dirty books, but you'd go and find certain things and look it up, or you'd watch, we talked about, watch HBO and I think they call people, I don't know if I should even say this, but the Cinemax, they called it Skinemax. Anyway, like you learn things about the world from a very young age. And I mean, that's part of growing up. But innocent, and I don't, doesn't have to be necessarily just, things that are sexually provocative or just, I mean, innocent has all kinds of, innocent means you're unaware or you're naive or and whatever that may mean, and you come into knowledge. And so from the time we're born, we're always coming into more knowledge. But this has been stereotyped, as in youth, you are unaware for so many years, like in this period from, birth to whenever we're done with school. And then you're an adult and you're like, you have this protected space, which again, it comes from this very romantic thinking of, I mean, if we want to go back into Rousseau, and even John Locke, where, you're a blank slate and then you acquire knowledge. And the unfortunate part of that is that, the powers that be, usually adults, if you don't correspond to this idea of innocence, if you've had a life in which you've had to work, like the family in Outsiders, they've had to make do because their parents have died, or their friends, right? Their friends have also had challenging circumstances and they're hard scrabbled. And for whatever reason, because of their economic circumstances, they don't fit this idea that people in power in the town, the socials, they don't fit this category. And so we see this in very specific ways in The Outsiders, but this happens in lots of different ways. There's lots of studies that this happens also on racial lines, where people, for whatever reasons, think Black American children, that for whatever reason, people think people, and I guess you can take that for what you want when I say people, think, often Black and brown children are made, people judge them as older, and so they don't fit this idea of childhood innocence, and there are all kinds of repercussions because of that. And yeah, The Outsiders really challenges that idea of this innocent. And again, what does that even mean? Because there's that moment with that, Cherry Valance, says to Ponyboy, let's see, where's, I pulled it up here. She says, "You're not so innocent. You read a lot." And on the one hand, I think Ponyboy is this really interesting character. One, he's not quote unquote innocent because his parents have died. He's had to do a lot to get by, and in the years, the short time period after his parents' death. But on the other hand, or even Johnny, like they are very sweet, I guess you could say, and I think people might call them innocent, even though they've had to deal with a lot.
They have a lot of street knowledge.
Yeah.
They have to be careful about getting jumped by, and so it's dangerous to walk alone. But yeah, there's a sweetness about them that they haven't become, what's the word I'm looking for? They haven't
Jaded?
become, yeah, jaded. They haven't become jaded.
They're not Dallas.
Yeah, Dallas is definitely jaded.
Mhm. He has a
Definitely.
kind of, a nihilism to him.
Oh, totally. Absolutely.
And
Yeah. And, I think this idea of innocence, my mother, I had the run of the public library. She had no idea what I was actually reading. None. I think I read Clan of the Cave Bear when I was in fifth
my
grade.
mom had a copy of that, and I remember looking and I was like, I was, like, trying to find the nerdy parts because I just had heard, her mom was like, "You can read
Yeah.
this."
Yeah.
Because
Totally.
my mom listened to it. I think she was listening to it on audio, but there was also we also had a copy, in our house. But I remember, like, my mom picked me up from school, and she's like, "Oh," she wouldn't keep listening to the audiobook. So, but then I found the book on a bookshelf, and I was like, "Oh, why won't you let me listen to it?" But
Yeah. I think that innocent concept is really relative. I think
yeah.
you're absolutely right.
And I do want to say, and I said this sometimes in my classes, and I say that I like this is this myth of innocence, and some students are like they're looking at, and I say, well, when we say that we are ignoring the complexity of the youth experience, and we are as you said earlier, we're undermining all the things that young people experience. And again, like you said, it is relative, right? One person maybe what they find challenging and complex and difficult, the death of their goldfish, because that's what they've experienced. And maybe to someone who's had the death of a parent, that seems relatively minor, but that's what they know. And so again, when we call them innocent or we think of them naive, we are not thinking about, their realities. And we're not valuing their full humanity. And this often happens with young people too, where we don't even treat them like when are removed from our own youth experience. We look back at young people, and we kind of remove their own humanity by thinking of their challenges as
Just simple.
superficial or simple. Yeah, and it's again, we're not treating them as full humans.
Right. Well, you've noted that Hinton believes teenagers have seen too much to be innocent. Given that young readers often face difficult realities, social, economic, political, which you've mentioned a lot of them, that kind of expose the hollowness of this assumption of innocence, how does the attempt to censor young adult literature like The Outsiders become particularly harmful when the subject matter reflects the complex realities that teenagers already face?
Oh my goodness. I know we only have so long, so I will try. Like, I could talk forever about this. And I have an assignment called Challenging Censorship, and I have students look at the list that I'm sure you've poured over of challenged and banned books, and I have them write letters, to the districts or the people that have banned the book. And again, rather than writing like a demeaning, I have them write some. This is kind of like a different close reading assignment where I have them, you know, write why the book shouldn't be banned by looking at the book and providing scenes and why those scenes are important to young people, right? And again, looking at the book itself rather than just like a diatribe about blah, 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 but looking at those scenes. And this is why I just like, I think the answer to any book that someone might find objectionable is not to ban it. It's to put out other books. People have the right to look at it at all things, I would think. But especially for marginalized identities or communities. I mean, these stories for young people, they're not corrupting them. They're giving them stories that can aid them in their own development, or they can feel not alone. How many? Again, The Outsiders. This is published in 1967. A lot has happened since then, and we have lots of we have so many stories that are geared toward young adults. But at that time, I mean, just thinking about the stories that depicted those of the lower class from their perspective, those were fewer and far between unless you want to like pick up like Oliver Twist.
Right.
Oliver Twist had great, did a lot actually for uh social um social development. I mean, Charles Dickens, even though he wasn't a great guy, he deeply cared about helping the economically disadvantaged. Again, if you want to read Oliver Twist, you can read Oliver Twist. But which again, I think it's a good book, but maybe not the most accessible book to an audience today. But I still think kids can pick up, or anyone can pick up the Outsiders today and read it in 2 hours. I can imagine so many kids, young people, and just being in like middle school or high school when on the one hand, all you want is to feel like an individual separate from your family, right? You want to feel like I'm autonomous. But on the other hand, you just want to belong to your friend groups. And so anything that marks you as different in some way is, I was going to say traumatizing, but it's probably, I don't want to make light of trauma. So many people, coming from the perspective of, and I think class is one of those things that's, I find in talking with students, I find it's really hard. Maybe even more today. Race can, because I think the topic of race is more, it's more in the open now. People are talking about it in ways. I think there's I don't want to say it's easy, but I think, and maybe it's because people talk about civil rights. I don't know, but I feel, and definitely in the wake of George Floyd, I just think that people can talk about this in different ways. But I think class people get embarrassed by it. Are you wearing the right brand or this or that? I don't know. I feel like students have a really tough time talking about that.
Well, and I think we elide class a lot as an American society. We're all supposed to be equal, but we're not, and we don't really have the social mobility that we used to have. So it becomes really hard to talk about.
We don't have the social mobility we used to have, and I think, but we still equate economic circumstances with morality.
Yes.
Often, right? Like how, or how your salary or how much your family makes, even if you're a kid and you have no control over that, how much money your family makes is somehow equated to fitness or goodness or something. And I see with students, they want to make so much money or this or that. And I have to really work to get at that from students.
Yeah, for sure.
And again, when you're a young person, when it doesn't make a lot of sense, whether it's, and I think back sometimes to when I was a kid and just the things we would do. I say we, like on the, I in the lunchroom or this, and how often kids who were economically disadvantaged, maybe they couldn't take a bath and people would make fun of them and call them names, and I don't know if I actively participated in the making fun of, but I didn't stop it.
Right. Yeah.
And it's and that's probably, is that still going on? Probably. And maybe just we do in different social media, and there are all kinds of issues with social media and screen time. So maybe they're like, the story they hear about people like not talking because they're all on their phones, right? Or I see in my classrooms, right? Like I come in, I'm like, hi, and they're just on their phone. So maybe they're not like actively like making fun of someone, but maybe they're bullying, through social media.
Yeah. Well, you've also written about how Ponyboy uses the romantic narrative of Gone with the Wind to process the trauma and the violence that he experiences. So, how does this deliberate juxtaposition of realism, the severe socioeconomic conflict faced by the greasers, and romanticism, which is the flawed idea of Southern gallantry, how does this help Ponyboy construct a self identity and give meaning to the tragic events that he experiences, particularly those that involve Johnny and Dally?
Yeah, well, it's funny. We talk about the Outsiders, and it's kind of began this idea of YA publishing, or it kind of launched YA publishing, but it also, in terms of storytelling, it started this idea of new realism. Realism is an idea that many people who studied their American literature, Stephen Crane and Theodore Dreiser, like that idea of realism. A lot of scholars and then also writers of YA, they talk about like the new realism, which again from the 60s on, you get these stories, and again it's often associated with YA, but I think some people might stereotype, oh, like teen pregnancies or like grittiness, and so we do have this idea of grittiness, and again we see the realities of these kids, young people, in Outsiders. But at the same time, I mean, the Outsiders, the story is pretty wild, right? It's like you have this, you know, these kids that are together, but then they get in this gang. Not to say that there's not gang fights, but they get in this fight and they flee to this church to hide out, and they bleach their hair so no one will know who they are. And then and like you said, while they're doing this, they're reading, Gone with the Wind, which is, kind of helped perpetuate, the ideas of the lost cause and whatnot. Margaret Mitchell herself was pretty radical, but she was still part of this lost cause propaganda. But this idea of the gallant, Confederate person, and so that could be a whole other conversation. But we'll say this idea of this romanticism and this kind of myth making that Johnny and Ponyboy are part of. They're holed up in this church and they're like reading this, and this idea of the mythos of what it is to be brave and become, it really shows this idea of the kind of reciprocity between literature, art, storytelling, and quote unquote real life, right? Like what we see is truth or real, we often get from our stories, right? And there again, I always draw this on a whiteboard when I am teaching literature or really anything, and I have like one side that says art, whether we're thinking fashion, film, novels, whatever, and then quote unquote truth or real life or whatever. And I show that these are always informing and reflecting one another, right? They're always informing and reflecting one another. And so we see in real time, basically in the story, how Johnny kind of takes up this idea of gallantry that he's consumed through Gone with the Wind. And we see this in all kinds of things, right? Think about when I was a teenager and in college, and how my ideas of morals and ethics came from like the girl rockers I was listening to, and my very limited idea of kind of white feminism, right, came from those, and it then later expanded when I read more and thought about other things. But so much of who we think we are comes from the art we take in, at a broad expanse of art. And so we really see this idea of the romance, right? Like it's a really wild plot line. Even though I think our characters feel very real, the eventual plot is pretty kind of, romantic, that we see really coming from this reading of Gone with the Wind. And then later, of course, the very famous line that everyone knows is "Stay Gold, Ponyboy," which comes from a Robert Frost poem. And Robert Frost is an interesting writer to think of. On the one hand, he's grounded in the very nature and realness of New England, or he's associated with that. And some people think it's very like lofty or idealistic, and it can be, but he also had the very, challenges that you see in his poetry. So again, it's that weight between this realism, but it's mixed in with romanticism, and how individuals interpret that. And Johnny, who was very much this, I don't know, he's like the weak, small, shy, reluctant character, and he becomes the hero, the sacrificial hero. And again, JC, Johnny Cade, he's the one that sacrificed. Your symbolism, if you want that. But I mean, I would say that's probably the romanticism that probably lends itself to why it's stuck around, maybe.
Well, and also like the character of Cherry Valance, thinking about romanticism, because she's like, I might fall in love with Dallas Winston, because I fell in love with Bob Sheldon because they're bad boys, know, and I'm like, girl, come on.
It's just still like this idea of the bad boy. I talk to my students and I talk about this all the time, like, oh, the good girls want the bad boys, even when I'm talking about fairy tales. And, we look at Little Red Riding Hood, and I'll get to, but if you read the original circulating stories and fairy tales were not created for children. They were part of an adult culture that circulated and were just reflecting things people are experiencing and working through things. And something like Little Red Riding Hood, if you look at those, I mean, the wolf says, take off all your clothes and get in. I mean, it's basically the original story of rape, right? But you have this kind of wolf figure, right? And whether you know, if you want to associate that on into like dangerous liaisons kind of thing, where you have this like wolfish figure that kind of takes advantage of the innocent. But we still see that in culture where we have this, you know, innocent, quote unquote, girl who wants the bad boy. But that mythos, that romance, I think we still fall into. And, you know, thinking, one of my colleagues, Michelle Abate, wrote a great scholarly article about The Outsiders, and she looked at it through the lens of these figures in the wake of boy bands. And again, in the 60s, it would have been, you know, you still had Beatles and you had the Monkees, and how you would read it, and you had these figures who were kind of romanticized amid all the social upheaval happening in the late 19th. But we see that even later on when we get boy bands of the 90s and early 2000s, when there are, you know, all kinds of things happening with Enron and internet and international conflict. You know, young people are looking these bright and shiny, and everyone could identify with one. And it was a way to, I don't want to necessarily escape, but kind of also work through what's happening.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, and Ponyboy is not only the subject of the narrative, but also the creator of his own story
Mhm.
through writing it down, which we discover that he has been doing. We're reading his written record in the final pages, is when we discover that. And similarly, S.E. Hinton wrote this novel, you know, when she was very young, creating a narrative that was more reflective of reality of 60s teens lived experience, which was perhaps not she wasn't seeing that in the literature that was
Yeah.
available to her at the time.
Yeah. She has great quotes, and she says, okay, I didn't care about getting a date for the prom. And that's what all the books that were written by usually older people, usually probably older women, thinking about what would be appropriate for young people. And she's like, that's
Yeah.
not what I cared about.
Yeah, exactly. And so I thought that was very interesting too. Anyway, so what is one concrete lesson or final thought from The Outsiders that you would like to leave with our listeners?
Maybe just to add on to what you were saying about how at the end of the book, we see that Ponyboy is writing his own story. And again, this is a story about the power of creation. And, you know, one argument could be, right, because it starts off, he's coming out of a movie theater, and this kind of goes back to the idea of romanticism. Ponyboy loves to escape into the movies, right? He loves the romance of the movies of, is it James Dean? No,
Was it Marlon Brando?
Paul Newman.
Paul
Like,
Newman.
he wants
Yeah.
to think about Paul Newman and that romance of movies and the possibilities of what we can create. He hooks into that. And again, this is, you know, like I said, this could be a story about storytelling, whatever form that is, whether it's writing or filmmaking or visual art. Because I think that's what gives the book its hope, right? That there's, you know, hope people have read this, but you know, Johnny dies, Dallas dies, like, you know, and these are kind of orphans, right? Like, there's a lot of things that people could be pessimistic about here, but this book is very optimistic, and that comes through the creation of storytelling and the ability for one to tell their own story. And again, at the beginning of the book, Ponyboy is without his parents. He is poor. At the end of the book, he is still poor. Right, he is still a greaser. His change, his prospect, or the way in which he is making it through is through his writing.
Right.
Through the creation, he's taking control of the story through writing it, and so we get an optimism from that. And I always say too to you know, my friends or my students or you know, whoever's listening to me, in a sense, I see almost all art is hopeful because it's created in the first place. Right, even the most nihilistic of stories, it's still out there and it's saying something. There's still some idea that it wants to communicate, and in that, I think there's always hope. And so I think, again, even though The Outsiders is very grim in what happens, and it's very true to maybe not some of the more wild parts of the story, but the economic realities, or, you know, you can see this translated today, whether it's a story about racial divisions or people's sexual or gender identities being challenged. Like, I think you can read these into it, in the way people feel like outsiders. I think there is optimism in the way people can, again, create their stories in another way. Again, whether it's writing or poetry or fashion design, Ponyboy gives us hope that we can take the very devastating traumatic in the true sense of the word, incidents, and create art from it. Now, again, I also don't want to like glamorize trauma in that way, but I think like that's how we work through the low points, the traumatizing points of our life is through storytelling.
Yeah, and you're right. It is ultimately a hopeful book, even though all these bad things happen in it and to the characters. Well, Paige, thank you so much
Thank
for,
you.
talking to me today and providing your insights about this book. I couldn't have picked a better expert on this particular volume. The next book that we'll be looking into will be Mad Honey by Jodi Picoult and Jennifer Finney
She's
Boylan.
challenged a lot.
Yeah, very much challenged. And so that's the next one in the queue in a few weeks after this one is released. And as Isaac Asimov said, any book worth banning is a book worth reading.
Booked and banned and bound by pages, stories hiding through the ages, whisper truths that still ring clear for those who choose to listen here.